Have you ever felt someone pull away from you, and deep down, something in you kept whispering, "This is not over"? Not because you were in denial, not because you were weak, but because the connection felt too real to end in silence, too deep to disappear without a trace. And if you stay until the end of this video, you will understand something most people never do about avoidance. The moment they go cold is often not the moment they stop feeling. And once you truly understand that, you will stop blaming yourself for what their fear made them do. Because this is where so many people break themselves. They think distance means indifference. Silence means replacement. Withdrawal means the love was fake. But human psychology is rarely that simple, especially when it comes to someone with avoidant patterns. What looks like rejection on the outside can actually be emotional overload on the inside. What feels like abandonment to you may be panic to them, and that does not make it fair. It does not make it right, but it does make it deeper than most people are willing to admit. An avoidant does not always leave because they do not care. Sometimes they leave because caring started to cost them too much emotionally. Your presence began to reach places inside them they had spent years trying to numb. Your consistency touched wounds they never healed. Your love made closeness feel real. And real closeness is dangerous to someone who learned somewhere early in life that love can come with pressure, disappointment, engulfment, or pain. So instead of leaning in, they lean away. Instead of explaining, they shut down. Instead of saying, "I am scared of what this is making me feel," they disappear into distance and call it needing space. That is the part most people never understand. Avoidants often do not experience connection the same way openly attached people do. Where you feel intimacy as warmth, they may feel intimacy as exposure. Where you feel emotional depth as safety, they may feel it as risk. Not because you did something wrong, not because your love was too much, but because their nervous system was trained to survive by keeping too much closeness at arm's length. They may want love, they may crave it in private, they may fantasize about it when they are alone, but when it actually arrives and asks them to stay emotionally present, everything inside them starts sounding an alarm. And if you have ever been on the receiving end of that, you know how painful it is. Because the cruelty of avoidant behavior is not always loud. Sometimes it is quiet. Sometimes it comes in delayed replies, emotional flatness, mixed signals, disappearing warmth, conversations that suddenly feel empty, and that strange coldness from someone who once made you feel chosen. One day they are there, the next it feels like you are reaching through glass. And the hardest part is not just losing them. The hardest part is losing your sense of certainty, losing your footing, losing the emotional reality you thought the two of you were building together. So you start asking the questions that slowly poison your peace. Was I too available? Did I care too much? Did I say too much? Was I not enough? Was any of it even real? And that is where people begin to betray themselves. They stop trusting their own experience. They rewrite the truth to make the other person's distance make sense. They start carrying guilt that was never theirs to hold. They begin shrinking themselves in hopes that maybe if they become easier to love, the avoidant will finally stop running. But here is the truth that can change everything. You cannot heal someone by becoming less human. You cannot love someone into emotional availability by starving your own needs. You cannot prove your worth to a wounded nervous system by bleeding patience forever. And you cannot force clarity out of someone whose entire defense mechanism is built around avoiding emotional accountability. That is why chasing often makes things worse. The more pain you show, the more pressure they feel. The more you ask for reassurance, the more they interpret connection as demand. And then the very thing you are trying to save begins to collapse under the weight of misunderstanding. But this is where it gets deeper, because while you are sitting there trying to make sense of their distance, they are not always feeling nothing. In fact, some of them are feeling more than they know how to process. They just do not have the emotional tools to stay present with it. So instead of facing the discomfort of love, they create space. And at first that space feels like relief to them. It gives them room to breathe, room to regain control, room to stop feeling exposed. And this is why so many avoidants look calm after pulling away. It can almost feel offensive, like they walked away from something meaningful and slept just fine. But emotional truth does not always arrive immediately. Sometimes it comes later. After the nervous system settles, after the silence stretches, after the person they assumed would always be there begins to emotionally detach. And that is the painful irony of avoidant psychology. They often understand the value of connection only after they have escaped it. Not because they are evil, not because they are playing a game, but because emotional absence is sometimes the only thing strong enough to break through the walls they used to survive. When you were close, their fear was louder than their love. But when the closeness is gone, fear has less to fight against. And in that silence, something dangerous begins to happen for them. They start to feel what your presence was actually doing in their life. They start to notice the comfort they lost, the softness they dismissed, the emotional safety they could not appreciate while they still had access to it. And this is where so many people make the mistake of assuming silence means the story is finished. It is not always finished. Sometimes silence is the beginning of realization. Sometimes the distance they created becomes the very thing that forces them to confront what they were running from. And no, that does not mean every avoidant comes back. It does not mean every person grows. It does not mean every silence hides love. But it does mean this: someone pulling away is not always proof that you meant nothing. Sometimes it is proof that you touched something in them they did not know how to hold. And in the next part, we are going to break down the exact psychology behind why avoidants often realize your value too late, and why the moment they finally feel your absence is often the moment they begin to want you in a way they never admitted when you were still there. Most people think regret shows up instantly. They imagine that the second an avoidant walks away, some wave of loss hits them and they suddenly realize what they are about to lose. But that is not usually how it works. Their awareness often comes late, quietly, indirectly. Not in the middle of the relationship when love is asking something from them, but afterward, when the pressure is gone and the emptiness starts speaking louder than distraction ever could. Because when closeness begins to feel intense, an avoidant mind does not interpret it the way a secure heart would. It does not simply say, "This is beautiful, stay here." It often says, "This is getting too close. Protect yourself." The deeper the bond becomes, the more their internal alarm can start going off. Not because your presence is dangerous in reality, but because vulnerability wakes up old survival patterns. They may not even understand this consciously. They just know that something inside them starts tightening the moment emotions become real, expectations become visible, and intimacy begins asking them to be fully present. So what do? They create distance and call it freedom. They tell themselves they need room. They convince themselves they are overwhelmed, confused, uncertain, or emotionally tired. And to be fair, sometimes they genuinely do feel all of that, but underneath it is something more hidden. They are trying to escape the discomfort of being truly seen. Because to someone with avoidant tendencies, being loved deeply can feel less like peace and more like exposure. It can feel like standing emotionally naked in a place where they were taught to survive through control. That is why they often seem more comfortable with almost love than real love. They can handle connection as long as it stays slightly out of reach, as long as it remains somewhat undefined, as long as they still have an exit. But once something becomes emotionally solid, once the bond starts carrying weight, once they realize they matter to someone in a serious way, their fear starts rewriting the meaning of the relationship. What was once warmth now feels like pressure. What was once comfort now feels like obligation. What was once beautiful now begins to feel dangerous simply because it asks them to stay open. And this is where people misunderstand them the most. They assume the avoidant is cold because the bond meant little, but often the exact opposite is true. The more meaningful the connection becomes, the more intense their urge to create space can grow. Not because they want to lose you, but because they do not know how to remain close without feeling trapped by their own emotions. That is why their timing is so painful. They often retreat at the exact moment when things begin to matter most. Then comes the silence, and at first that silence can feel like relief to them. The emotional heat drops, the tension disappears, the need to explain, reassure, or emotionally respond fades. They can breathe again. they can go back into routines, distractions, work, scrolling, surface level conversations, and whatever else helps them stay disconnected from what they actually feel. This is why, in the beginning, they can look so unaffected, so composed, so strangely untouched by something that shattered you. But numbness is not peace, avoidance is not closure, and emotional suppression has an expiration date. Sooner or later, the nervous system stops reacting to the closeness that once overwhelmed them, and when that happens, the deeper truth begins to rise. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in fragments, in strange moments, in the quiet after a long day, in the drive home, in the empty bed, in the missing voice they used to take for granted, in the realization that the emotional presence they ran from is no longer there to return to whenever they feel lonely. That is when memory changes shape. At first, they may have focused on everything that felt difficult, the intensity, the emotional demands, the vulnerability, the discomfort of being needed. But with distance, the brain often softens what once felt threatening and begins to highlight what felt meaningful. Suddenly, your consistency becomes visible, your patience becomes visible, the way you showed up becomes visible. The emotional safety they could not fully receive while they were inside the relationship starts becoming clearer only after they are outside of it. And this is the cruel part. People who are emotionally avoidant often do not fully understand the value of stable love while they still have access to it. Their defense mechanisms distort it, their fear interrupts it, their need for control keeps them from relaxing into it. So they do not always recognize your worth when you are present. They recognize your impact when your absence starts leaving marks on their daily life. That is when regret begins, not always as some dramatic breakdown. Sometimes, regret looks much smaller, more private, more humiliating. It can look like checking your profile and saying nothing, rereading old messages, wondering if you are moving on, feeling restless at night for reasons they cannot explain, thinking about the emotional steadiness they once had, and realizing how rare it was, missing your energy, but not knowing how to face the shame of what they did with it. Because shame plays a huge role here, and most people never talk about that. An avoidant does not just struggle with feelings. They often struggle with the shame of having them, the shame of needing someone, the shame of missing someone they pushed away, the shame of realizing they may have damaged something real because they were too emotionally underdeveloped to handle it. And shame does not always create action. Sometimes it creates more silence, more hesitation, more delay, more inner conflict. They may want to reach out, but pride blocks them. They may think about you constantly, but ego tells them to stay hidden. They may feel the loss deeply, but the idea of facing what they caused feels heavier than staying quiet. This is why many people get confused when they sense that an avoidant misses them, yet still does nothing clear. They assume if they really cared, they would just say it. But human psychology is rarely that clean. A person can feel longing and still be emotionally frozen. A person can feel loss and still be too ashamed to move. A person can want closeness and still be terrified of what closeness demands. And that is why their realization often happens in private, long before they are capable of expressing it in public. But there is another layer that matters even more. Avoidants do not usually miss you most when you are still chasing. As long as you are still available in the same way, a part of them unconsciously assumes the door is still open, that your warmth can still be accessed, that your care is still waiting. And as long as that emotional safety net remains, they do not always have to fully face the consequences of their distance. Everything changes when your energy shifts. When your presence no longer feels guaranteed, the emotional reality becomes sharper. When you stop reaching, stop explaining, stop trying to pull meaning out of silence, something inside them often begins to register the loss in a completely different way. Not because they enjoy being ignored, but because your withdrawal removes the illusion that they can come back to your emotional availability whenever it suits them. That is when your value becomes undeniable. Not when you were overgiving, not when you were proving, not when you were trying to be enough for both people, but when your absence finally forces them to sit with what your presence truly meant. And the truth is, some people only wake up emotionally when comfort is no longer waiting for them in the same place. Some people only understand what they had after their own defenses stop protecting them from reality. Some people only begin to feel love clearly once they are left alone with the consequences of running from it. That does not mean you were meant to suffer just to teach them a lesson. It means their timeline for emotional truth is often delayed by fear. And once fear loses its grip, reality starts entering through the cracks. That is when the mask starts slipping. That is when the emotional walls stop feeling as solid as they once did. That is when they begin to realize that what they escaped was not weakness. It was something rare. And when that truth finally reaches them, it does not always arrive as peace. It often arrives as disruption, a strange emotional restlessness they cannot easily explain, a heaviness in moments that used to feel normal, a quiet ache that starts following them into ordinary parts of life. Because once someone has felt a bond that touched them in a real way, pretending it meant nothing becomes harder to maintain. And eventually, there comes a point where even distance can no longer protect them from what they actually feel. This is the turning point people wait for without always understanding it. Not the moment the avoidant suddenly becomes perfect, not the moment they transform overnight into someone deeply expressive and emotionally fearless, but the moment something inside them begins to admit a painful truth. I still want the person I pushed away, and that realization can be deeply unsettling for someone who built their entire emotional identity around needing less, feeling less, and depending less, because wanting you means something bigger than desire. It means they have to face the fact that your role in their life was not casual. It means they have to stop pretending that what happened between you was small, temporary, or easily replaceable. It means they have to sit with the possibility that they did not walk away from pressure. They walked away from connection. And that is a much harder truth to carry because it's story they use to protect themselves. At first, many of them try to resist this realization. They distract themselves, they stay busy, they seek noise, they tell themselves it is just loneliness. They convince themselves they are only attached to the comfort, not the person. But emotional truth has a way of returning, especially when it has never been fully processed. And what keeps bringing it back is not always memory alone, it is your changed energy. There is something powerful that happens when you stop orbiting around someone's confusion. Something shifts when you no longer chase closure from a person who only knew how to offer distance. You begin to stand differently, speak differently, feel differently. Even in silence, your emotional position changes. And people can feel that more than they admit, especially avoidants. Because while they may struggle to respond to emotional pursuit, they are highly sensitive to emotional movement. They notice when your attention is no longer wrapped around them. They notice when your softness is no longer reaching in the same direction. They notice when your absence becomes emotionally real rather than temporarily quiet. And that is often the exact point where something breaks open inside them. Not because they suddenly love loss, but because your shift removes the emotional cushion they were unconsciously relying on. It confronts them with something they did not expect, that your care was not endless, and your heart was not built to stay in one-sided limbo forever. That is when the fantasy of I can come back later starts collapsing. That is when the emotional consequences become heavier. That is when the mind begins replaying everything with a level of seriousness it once avoided. And this is where many avoidants experience a kind of inner collision. One part of them wants to reach out, another part wants to hide, one part wants closeness, another part fears the vulnerability that closeness demands. One part misses your presence deeply, another part feels unworthy of it now. So they live in contradiction, and contradiction is exhausting. They may start testing the connection in subtle ways, a small message, a reaction, a sudden reappearance that feels almost random. Not because they are always playing games, but because direct honesty can feel too exposing. They want to know if the bridge still exists without fully admitting they are the one who burned it. They want reassurance without risking rejection. They want access to your energy without immediately confronting the pain attached to how they left. But this is where most people get trapped again, because the moment the avoidant starts leaning back in, the heart that was starved for clarity often lights up and says, "Finally, this means everything is changing." But emotional realization and emotional readiness are not the same thing, and that distinction can save you from a second heartbreak. Someone can realize they still want you and still not be capable of loving you well. Someone can miss you deeply and still not have the maturity to hold what they lost. Someone can feel the weight of your absence and still be too fractured internally to meet you with consistency, courage, and truth. Wanting you is not the finish line. It is only the moment they can no longer lie to themselves about what you meant. That is why this stage is so important, because it reveals something many people spend months or years trying to force. You never needed to convince them of your value. Time often does that on its own. Distance often does that on its own. The emotional contrast between life with your presence and life without it often says more than your explanations ever could. And still, there is a deeper reason this moment hits them so hard. It is not only that they miss your attention. It is not only that they miss your warmth. It is not only that they miss being cared for. It is that your connection likely offered them something their defenses had never fully known how to trust. Emotional safety without control. That is rare, and when someone with avoidant patterns loses a connection that was patient, grounded, and sincere, they do not just lose a person, they lose a mirror. A mirror that reflected who they could have been if fear had not been in charge. A mirror that showed them what closeness might have felt like if they had stayed open long enough to receive it. And that can haunt a person far more than loneliness ever will. Because now the loss is no longer abstract, it becomes personal. It becomes specific. It becomes tied to your voice, your energy, your steadiness, your emotional depth, your way of making them feel seen without trying to own them. And once that becomes clear, the ache changes. It is no longer about simply being alone. It becomes about realizing they may have let go of something they were not likely to find again in the same form. That is the moment their emotional walls begin to crack. Not all at once. Not in a dramatic movie-style confession. Not always in a clean or satisfying way. But internally, the structure starts weakening. The old stories begin to fail. The emotional numbness begins to thin out. The image they tried to maintain of being untouched starts becoming harder to believe. And somewhere in that private collapse, they begin to understand a truth they could not hold when they still had you close. Some people do not leave your heart immediately just because they left your life physically. Some people stay with you in silence, in memory, in regret, in the places where truth waits patiently for fear to run out of places to hide. That is why this realization can feel so overwhelming to them, because now they are not just facing missing you, they are facing themselves, their patterns, their damage, their timing, their inability to protect what they secretly wanted to keep. And for many avoidants, that is the hardest part of all, not feeling love.